If you do that in a pine stand this fall and then followed up with a prescribed burn, you're gonna love what you see come springtime, and it's going to be a whole lot better going forward. I think just having a forester looking out for your property on your behalf, because financially, it can have a big impact on the decisions you make, and so you're planting and managing timber now for the next 25 plus years. So I think it's important to have somebody that's kind of looking out for you and helping you make those decisions and understanding those prescriptions and understanding what the prices are and the different application methods and everything. It's just good to have somebody that's kind of on your side, helping you walk through all that.
Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Gulsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
This is going to be a really good one today, though, y'all, I think. I mean, we've been talking a lot about forest management lately, that's relevant to the landowner. And we're going to continue with that theme today with Michael Heatherly, an awesome, fantastic guest that we have here. He's a forester with Sizemore and Sizemore. I almost said what you asked me not to. But Michael, tell us a little bit about what you do in that role, and we'll get into it.
Yeah, first, I appreciate having the opportunity to come on here. I have an avid listener of the show, and I think I'm up to speed on every episode of the podcast. So it's an honor to be here.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. So I graduated in 2008 in forestry from Auburn and started out as just a field technician with Sizemore and Sizemore, doing forestry consulting work, and have slowly grown into the role of being more of a forest manager. And in the past 5 years, we started doing more land sales. So I currently hold our broker's license with our timberland sales as well. But day to day, I'm working with mostly private landowners, and we also have some clients that are, investment timber companies. So, but that's kind of my day to day role is forest management with private landowners, and so.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that connected you and I to begin with is that, as opposed to some foresters, you do a lot of habitat-focused work.
Yeah.
I would say much more than the average forester does.
We really do, and we've kind of gotten into the past probably 8 or 10 years even to where I would say the majority of our landowner clients now have wildlife management as at least a secondary, objective for their property. We used to be more focused on, most of our landowners were about maximizing timber income. And it seems in the past 10 years has really transitioned to where that wildlife management is either the top, goal, or it's the secondary objective on the property.
Yeah.
And so we've really focused a lot on that the past few years.
Well, as a wildlife biologist, that excites me.
Yeah.
the shifting objectives.
I agree. I also kind of feel like I've observed a very similar trend. And, it's just been interesting watching that play out. I mean, everybody that comes to me, or I'm assuming Will has wildlife number one, but does seem like a broader trend in general that, that land management objectives are shifting, and wildlife is often, it's always been, I guess, in the top three in terms of like serving landowners in the South at least, but now it seems to commonly rank one.
Yeah. I used to get nervous when I'd recommend to a landowner that they thin below, optimal stocking or a traditional fifth row or whatever. But now it's like, you used to have to almost brace yourself for the conversation or the debate that was coming after that, but now it's just like, okay, tell me where to sign. And that's where we want to go today. And Michael, where I thought we could probably start out with is, let's just pretend that, we're landowners. We just bought our first piece of property. We want to manage it for turkeys and, maybe deer and other wildlife. What do we do? How does this process start? Like once we reach out to you, and kind of what are the nuts and bolts of that?
Yeah, so the first thing that I always want to know when somebody reaches out to us is what their objectives are on the property. That's kind of the number one question, and kind of the starting place. Is what do you want to do? Do you want to maximize timber, have wildlife as kind of secondary objective, or do you not care anything about timber production and focus on wildlife? So that kind of puts us on track of what kind of recommendations that we make to a landowner. From there, we do a site visit, or we look at aerial photographs and kind of see what maybe some options are. I'm not a biologist, but I've spent a lot of time in the woods with biologists on properties, where we've met with landowners and a biologist on site, and I've seen a lot of the recommendations and the practices that have been put in place. So there's some things that are kind of straightforward and simple, as far as if you have an unthinned pine plantation, we got to get some sunlight to the ground. I think everybody can agree on that. And then after that, depending on what comes up, if there needs to be a herbicide application or, a fire, rotation put into place. So we usually just start out with objectives and trying to figure out what people are interested in. And then based on what they have on their property, what kind of timber stands they have, then we make recommendations based on that to meet their objectives. And, we are foresters primarily, but I want to do whatever the landowner wants. If their objective is wildlife, I have a lot of people that say I'm not interested in any clear cutting, and we're fine with that. We're perfectly fine with, if the timber needs to be thinned or we need to get some sunlight in there, we can do that. And we do what the landowner wants to do to achieve their objectives.
Yeah. Marcus and I were just having a conversation about that on a recent episode, where we sometimes feel like if a landowner has us out, they feel apologetic if they have objectives other than turkeys, like whether that be deer, whether that be timber, or cows, or something else. And it's like, you never have to apologize for what you want. It's your land, and my job is to just help you make it what you want it to be.
Yeah. And also, when we were having that discussion, this may have come up, but you don't have to use all of your property to maximize one objective. In that case, it may be turkeys, but you may have some stands that are really productive timber, and you want to maximize timber there. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean you have to do that everywhere. Right. It also doesn't mean that you have to, I hesitate to say this, but you don't have to maximize turkeys everywhere. That's not your only objective. So, I have found it interesting. Michael, one of the things that when you were just talking then, that kind of resonated with me, I guess before, we really wanted to get into the nuts and bolts of as a landowner, what are the steps they need to take, and even like how do they get the timber sold and get people on the property and all that stuff. But one of the things that you just said was a lot of landowners or I guess if they have a wildlife objective, they may never see clear cutting as an endpoint of a stand. So I'm just curious. I'd like to hear you talk about that, because I talk to landowners about this regularly, particularly that have like loblolly pine on, stands on their property, and I have talked to them about clear cutting doesn't necessarily have to be the endpoint if they have a wildlife objective. So would you mind sharing your perspective on that?
Sure. And I think one thing that's important too, and something that is good from a timber standpoint, is that if you do cut timber, whether it be thinning or clear cut, that usually generates some income that you can turn around and put back into the property. So that's really important, to be able to, if you want to get your property in really good shape, you're probably going to spend some money on herbicide and fire lanes, and there's going to be some input there on cost. And so having some timber harvest planned is usually a really good thing. So when we look at older stands of loblolly pine, the couple of things that concern me a little bit is timber outgrowing the markets. It seems there's been a really big shift from people, the mills wanting you to grow big, large saw timber now to where chip and saw size trees, like a 12 to 14 inch tree, is kind of the optimum size tree, as far as that's typically going to be your highest value other than a pole. That's typically going to be your highest value. When timber gets to be in that 12 to 15 inch size at breast height, that's kind of going to be your economic maturity of that stand. So you kind of have to make a decision of, knowing if you thin that and don't clear cut that now, then it's not being as productive as it could be. Am I going to outgrow the markets if I continue to grow this stand and it gets to be 16, 18 inches at DBH? Is it going to outgrow my local market? So there's, depending on what area you're in, that's something to consider. And then, like you mentioned, Marcus, the clear cutting is not the kind of the end game. Are we clear cut this and all of our habitat's gone? Because what we've seen is if you have a stand that's been thin and well managed, and say you've done some herbicide applications throughout the rotation, you've done burning, you have that understory in good shape. When you clear cut that, if you come back in, especially with longleaf pine that you can manage with fire afterwards, you get good habitat almost immediately afterwards. And so you may have a lag period of a year where you've got a site prepped area that doesn't have anything grown, but as soon as the next spring comes, you're back into some pretty good habitat pretty quickly. So I think that's important so people understand that. I know people like to look at trees and they're pretty to look at, but sometimes that's the best option. Cut timber, get some income, use that money to put into other places on your property. And then, and longleaf pine's not the answer for everybody, but whenever we're looking, specifically for people who are interested in wildlife, we do recommend longleaf on a lot of sites, because you can burn it at such a young age and early and often as you want to.
I feel like I'm about to take us down a path that is kind of off topic of what we really originally wanted to talk about, but we do it all the time, so what the heck. But I think you brought up some really good points, Michael, and a clear cut is not always a bad thing, and I recommend clear cutting to landowners all the time. I mean, it's not just a net loss, but it can also be creation of a field, creation of a food plot, an early successional area. I might have to clear cut one of my stands to attract a buyer. And that's what I think we're going to get into in a little while, so that I have enough volume to make them interested in coming to my property and doing the other things that I need them to do, if that's thinning or something else elsewhere. So there's lots of reasons that you would potentially consider that, and it not always be a net negative in terms of the habitat quality of that site.
Yeah,
I think that's definitely an important point, especially, when we're working with people with turkeys. There's a lot of concern that, and it may be somewhat founded if you were going back with loblolly, but at least if you replanted with longleaf, just because you clear cut doesn't mean that there's no turkey habitat for the long term, like there could be with some regeneration techniques. But what about on the other side, Michael? Like, so you were talking about timber outgrowing the market. So let's say somebody is interested in thinning to a relatively low basal area and then trying to maintain that in perpetuity, so they don't want to ever clear cut. Sort of like more like a quail plantation model, I guess. And those trees do get bigger than the market. Are they done with options to harvest, or what do they do in that situation?
Yeah, so in our area, like a 25 or 26 inch butt is going to be the maximum size that you can take to a mill, and even that size is limited to a couple of different mills. And so, once you get to that size, you're really limited to any kind of timber harvest. And we'll talk about this later with the logging and just the demand and trying to get things done. Loggers like efficiency, and they like high productivity. And when you have a low basal area stand with a lot of large diameter trees, it's not very attractive to a logger.
Mhm.
So I think you almost have to make that decision at some point.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to thin this and you want to have this even like a quail type plantation look, you're pretty much committed to have that, and what we've done sometimes is we've interplanted some long leaf or short leaf,
Mm-hmm.
around those mature
Mhm.
trees so that you have some, control of your regeneration. But I think at a
Mhm.
certain point you've basically committed, like, I'm never going to cut this overstory, out of the stand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so even if they have a 60 basal area target or a 40 basal area target, once they get to that really large, it may even be hard for you to thin it to keep it that
Mhm.
low
Yeah,
over
for
the
sure.
Yeah.
long term.
I've encountered a couple of bigger plantations that have purchased their own logging equipment for that reason, and
Yeah,
I
I
mean
have
they're
to.
just cutting trees and stacking them a lot of
Mhm.
times.
Yeah, like at the pulp mill, typically like 25-inch butt's kind of the maximum on that too. So whenever you end up with these trees that are low basal area and they're large diameter, a lot of times they're not good enough quality to even take to a sawmill, and so they end up as pulpwood trees that are too big to go to the pulp mill too. So they almost become, from a timber value standpoint, almost become worthless from that sense. Obviously from an aesthetic standpoint and habitat, they're worth something
Mm-hmm.
to the
Mhm.
landowner, but
Right.
not as far as stumpage value.
Right. Yeah, so let's go ahead and get into that. The nuts and bolts discussion, I feel like, is how we keep referring to it. But landowner contacts you, you establish their objectives, and to meet those objectives, there's going to be some timber harvest involved. So, how does that process start, and what's it look like?
So eh, I don't want to sound like a professor will, but it depends, right? That's the answer you always get. It depends. Um, it depends on the what they have. Is it something that needs to be first thin that's never been thin? Is it all pulpwood? Is it older timber? Depends on what they have, and typically, just broadly speaking, a 30 or 40 acre stand of timber is about the minimum size that you need to get a crew to come in and do some type of timber harvest. Now, that could depend on the volume. You could have a stand that, if you're thinning, you may only be thinning one load to the acre. So
Mm-hmm.
30 loads is not as attractive, versus if you're clear cutting a 30 acre stand that may be running 4 or 5 loads to the acre, high volume. It's a whole lot more attractive for somebody. So we kind of look at what is on the landowner's property and try to make a good decision of how to market that timber. We sell timber by the ton, pay as cut, so they pay as they cut it, and we sell it lump sum. A lot of times when we're working with people who are wildlife minded, we're selling timber by the ton. We're negotiating so that we have a lot more control over when the timber's harvested. So
Mm-hmm.
the standard in timber harvest contracts, typically 12 months. 12 to 18 months is kind of a typical contract. Well, a lot of people, whenever their main objectives are deer and turkey hunting, they may not want you there in deer season or turkey season.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you start adding these restrictions to when somebody can be there, and certain months, say you're already on a property that can only be maybe harvested 6 months out of the year due to the road, condition of the roads, or just the condition of the ground on the property, and then you add another restriction of no deer, not during deer season or not during turkey season. Those are the kind of sales that we will try to negotiate directly with somebody, and then you can lay all those criteria out there ahead of time. Like, hey, do you have somebody that can get here between now and the end of October or by Thanksgiving? Or you can go ahead and kind of establish those parameters.
Yeah, it's nice when that's an option, but sometimes it's not. And if it's not, I mean, I can't tell you how many times that I've given landowners the advice. It's just like, rip the Band-Aid off, let them harvest this deer season or this turkey season, and you'll thank yourself in a couple years.
Yeah, I I totally agree with that.
Especially in this day and age where it can be hard to move wood sometimes.
It can be, and it can be really hard to move timber. And I'm one of the mindset, let's get it cut when we can get somebody in there to cut it, and then sit back and enjoy your place moving forward, because there's going to be things just like if it's not timber harvest, it's going to be herbicide. Like, hey, we're going to go into this winter and we've just killed out, your understory, but next year it's going to be great. So you're going to have one deer season where you're not going to have a lot of cover in there, one turkey season where it's more open than you'd like, but to get to the end goal, that's what you need to do. So that's usually, if people are willing to do that, that's the best thing, is to give a logging company the most options, the biggest time frame, most options. You're also going to get possibly more money for your timber, giving them if you're saying we're going to give you 12 months, they have a whole lot more flexibility as, timing out the markets and everything, versus you give them a 3 or 4 month contract. So it's typically going to lead to a little bit higher prices if you give them the more flexibility.
That makes sense.
So once the harvest has been planned and the actual operation starts, a lot of landowners ask, well, how do we make sure that the logger is hitting the prescription? Like what we wanted to happen as a result of this harvest, how we wanted the stand to look like.
Yeah, so that all be, and as a consulting force, that's something that we go out and kind of oversee and monitor the harvest while the logger's out there. But that would all be something that would be on a exhibit map in the contract, and it would be, the criteria would be outlined in the contract. If it's a first thinning, what your desired residual base layer is going to be after thinning, and the same with say something that's a second or third thinning. You're typically, thinning back to a certain density, and that would be up to us to kind of oversee that and make sure that we're, hitting that density. And the reason I mentioned on, pay as cut sales, and if you're doing an operator select harvest, a thinning where the operator's out there picking the trees to cut, that's the only way you can sell timber is by the ton. When you go to a lump sum sale, you have to have very defined boundaries. If it's a thinning, you would have to have the trees either marked to cut or marked to leave out there in order to sell it on a lump sum basis. And so
because the forester already knows the volume that's out there that
that's
they
right.
should be getting paid for in that situation.
Yeah, you would know on a lump sum sale, you need, if it's a thinning, you need to have either the leaf trees or the trees that get cut marked. We would go out there and cruise the timber, tell the landowner this is the volume we expect, and this is the prices, and then we would take bids on that on a lump sum basis. And the same as a clear cut, you have very defined boundaries, an estimate of the volume that's there, so you can give the landowner expectation, here's what the prices are going to be. So typically on lump sum sales, we recommend those if you have really good access, like all weather logging. You've got good road access. You're flexible with your length of contract. Like if you would allow a full 12 months, basically pretty unrestricted as far as that goes. And then we go out there and cruise the timber and give the landowner, we mark out the stream side management zones and anything so that we know exactly the acreage of what's to be sold. When you're looking at thinnings, if you're going to do a lump sum sale on a thinning, you have to have the trees marked, prior to selling the timber.
So, Mike, I think you're making a case for it, but I get asked this occasionally. So, a lot of people have land, and they might be interested in getting, a cut done or selling some timber. So, we didn't talk about this up front. We just kind of assumed that they already went and found a forester. But a lot of the things that you're talking about, like marking trees and trying to keep track of what the loggers are doing and all those sorts of things, that would be on the landowner unless they came to somebody like yourself.
That's
right?
Correct. Yeah. And so Alabama and a lot of the states have a designation as in Alabama, it's a registered forester. So there'll be a registered forester. You have to have a 4-year degree from an accredited program, 2 years of field experience, and then pass a test to be a registered forester. So you could be a registered.
That's administered by SAF, right? Society of American Foresters.
That's correct. Yeah, and there's a board of registered foresters in Alabama that kind of oversees that that license. So you could be a procurement forester and be registered, and we kind of designate ourselves as a consulting foresters, and we're also members of the Association of Consulting Foresters. That we have a little bit extra continuing education as a ACF member, and we basically have said, we have no business doing anything with procurement on the procurement side. But you basically have procurement foresters and then consulting foresters, and we work with the procurement foresters to sell the timber to landowners. But yeah, technically in Alabama, to advise landowners on forest management activities and timber inventory, tell them what the timber's worth, that sort of thing, you're supposed to be a registered forester.
So to put it in like a real estate analogy, because I think a lot of people are probably more familiar with that, like a consulting forester is more like a seller's agent and a procurement forester is more like a buyer's agent. Is that right?
Yeah, I think you could say that. I think
Michael thinks my analogy was weak. He's trying to get me an out.
Well,
it's not the first time.
I know. It won't be the last.
No, I think sometimes, I had a conversation with the landowner the other day, and a lot of times people call us and they don't really understand what our role is, right?
Yeah,
they don't know whether we're a timber buyer or what we do. And so I explain to them, hey, we're working for the landowner. We're working for you in your best interest. Well, then I get the comment, well, you're kind of the middleman, or you're the broker or whatever. And it's like, well, no, I personally, I see a place for the procurement foresters and what they do. They deal with the logging side and with the mills, and they have a lot of responsibility there to keep up with quotas. And we're on the side of working for the landowner. So I think
they're working for the good of the mill.
That's
the procurement forester.
The mill, and for their loggers, and to make sure that woods flow into the mill. And like, as a consultant, I have basically no contact with the mill. Whenever they go on quota, they put a logger on quota, I hear that from the procurement forester, like, hey, we can't haul pulpwood the end of this week because we're, the mill's shutting off, that sort of thing. So I feel like there's kind of a place for both sides in the business. But I mean, that's kind of the difference. We tell landowners that we're working for them for their best interest, and we don't have any interest in the procurement side.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of thinking through that. Not you're providing several things that you have the expertise for that most landowners don't have for themselves, but you're also there to protect them in a sense. Like you're working in their best interest and making sure that the prices that they're getting, what gets cut, how it gets cut, how the land is left, all those sorts of things are in accordance with their contract.
That's right. And that would be, if somebody asks, what are your services? I mean, that's basically when we get ready to sell timber, we know what the acreage is. We know kind of estimated timber volumes. We mark out the sale boundaries. We either negotiate or bid out the sale to, procurement companies. And then once we get a contract, then we write the contract in favor of the landowner to, have maybe an advance payment on a pay as cut sale that, once somebody puts a little bit of money down, that kind of helps ensure that they're going to show up and do the job. We have a performance deposit in there that, if gates get torn up or if the roads are left in bad shape, that kind of ensures that they're going to come back and do that. And so that's kind of what we do. We implement the contract. We oversee, once the timber harvesting starts, we're out there overseeing the job, communicating with the landowner, making sure that they're happy. And then we keep up with the loads and make sure that everything gets paid for, that gets hauled, and that sort of thing. And, Alabama has a best management practices for forestry, and I would say overall people are very good about complying with those, without us overseeing that. But we're there to make sure that things are done correctly, and in working for the best interest of the landowner.
And you're actually getting paid a fair price for the actual amount that you're selling, that they're taking off the land too.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to think. There's so many different questions I want to ask you right now that I think our audience would be interested in. But yeah, so making sure, we talked about the contract. what are you touched on this briefly, but just so that we're explicit with it, what are some of the things that are typically specified in a contract?
Well, some of the important things are the length of the contract is always really important, like we talked
Mm-hmm.
about earlier. How much time you're going to give somebody to cut the timber. Um, we do have the performance deposit in there that basically gets held in an escrow account to ensure that the contract everybody's in compliance with the contract. It's going to specify in there if it's like an operator select thinning, it's going to specify that it's a fourth or fifth row thinning, desired residual basal area plus or minus 10 square feet of basal area. So it specifies what gets harvested. If it's like a clear cut, it'll specify if we're taking out pines or other trees out of the streamside management zone or around the perimeter of the sale. It'll say the trees marked a certain way will get cut. It's got the per unit prices. Either if it's a per unit sale or pay as cut sale, it'll have the per unit prices in there and the product specification. So it gives you the specification for pulpwood, chip and saw timber poles, or whatever products that you have. It'll specify in there exactly what those product specifications are. If it's a lump sum contract, it'll have that lump sum, payment amount in there.
Mm-hmm.
Insurance requirements, we ask that the landowner and our company be listed as additional insured on their insurance policies before any harvesting begins. So that's some of the basics. I mean, our contract, I think, it's maybe only four pages or so, and it's something that's been kind of adjusted over the years. But the people that we work with on the buying side, they're used to seeing our contract and they're comfortable with it and they understand what those expectations are, and so we typically don't have a lot of problems.
Yeah. I would say that another major benefit to working with a forester, especially to the uninitiated, is there's so much kind of institutional knowledge that comes along with a local forester in terms of who are the best logging companies to work with, for instance. Like they're gonna leave your property in really good shape, and you may not always get to go with that contractor, but you at least have a good starting point of who to choose from, and then the markets, right? So like we should go ahead and cut these trees now versus they'll be a little bit more valuable if we wait 2, 3, 5, 10 years, whatever. Just like all those little nuanced details that because you work in that area every day and deal with those loggers, so you know what they're looking for.
Yeah, and one thing, just when you mentioned that, knowing kind of when to harvest and the what's in demand in the area and that sort of thing. There's one stand in particular that I'm thinking of that's the average diameter now is probably 12 inches or so, but the tree quality in this stand is just really good. I mean, the seedling genetics and everything were really good. We did a couple of marked thinnings in this stand, and it's just really high quality. Well, right now, let's just say, throwing out there, the stumpage price for chip and saw or small saw timber is probably about half right now, depending on what market you're in versus a pole.
Mm-hmm.
So letting those 12 or 13 inch trees grow just another inch in DBH to where they may meet that pole class, you could double your stumpage value right there,
Mm-hmm.
And so, and then vice versa, if you have a lot of, if your stand's averaging 12 or 13 inches and it doesn't have pole quality and somebody's interested in maximizing their income off of that, it may be time to cut it now. You may be at the peak of the market for your particular stand in your particular market if you don't have pole quality timber, but if you do and you have a high percentage of poles, just waiting a few years, you could double, your stumpage. So that's the kind of stuff that that we can see when we go out there, like, hey, hold on to this stand. If you're interested in clear cutting, let's hold it a few more years. Or you have health issues with, we had a lot of pine beetle infestations with the lack of thinning and, things like that. If you see issues where you're like, you really need to go ahead and cut this, and we can make a recommendation based on whatever we see out there.
Along those lines, it made me think about this when Will asked you that previous question. So, I guess I'm asking for you to tell us, but with landowners, are they just coming to you when they think they're ready to do it, or do you have some that you're working with over a long term where they may have long stints of time where they're not cutting anything? How does that work in terms of your relationship with landowners?
Yeah, so most of the time, what we do is once we've established a relationship with the landowner, we kind of keep that property in our database and keep up with what's going on out there, so that we kind of know year to year, like, hey, you have a long leaf stand that's getting ready to be, it needs to be burned. It hasn't had a burn since we planted it 2 or 3 years ago. It's ready to be burned. We know plantation ages out there when they're approaching thinning age. So we kind of keep up. Once we have an established relationship with a landowner, we kind of keep up with the database and know what those properties need. And a lot of times what we'll do, if somebody has enough acreage, we'll do like a 5 year, plan that just says tentatively, we think this is what needs to happen over the next 5 years, and that gives them kind of something to look at, and us too, to go back and say, okay, hey, we recommended, we need to thin this next year. We need to be out there inspecting that, making sure it's big enough to thin, and keeping in touch with the landowner. So that's what preferably what I like to do, just kind of give them a little, short term. Sometimes we go out 10 or 15 years on properties, but even just a 5 year plan of, hey, this is what can be expected over the next 5 years if we don't have any kind of natural disaster or anything to cause us to deviate from this. So
Mhm.
yeah.
So in that case, when you're kind of planning out, potentially mini stands that they're going to be in a window of time where you're looking at a thinning or some sort of harvest, and then on top of that, you're keeping up with what's going on with the market. So maybe next year the market is really well. So then you would come back to the landowners like, well, we planned on it being 2 years out, but the market's excellent right
Yeah.
now. So you should probably. So is that the sort of dynamic
Yeah,
that you're working with?
correct. Yeah. So we had several large timber sales that we had scheduled to sell. Just generally speaking, in our area, we get a little bit better prices in the wintertime. Things get wet, people can't get as much wood to the mill, the wood flow slows down, and you have a little peak in price. So we had several larger timber sales that we had scheduled to kind of put out for sale this fall. And about 6 weeks ago, we've been getting a ton of rain. May and June was really wet. I think one area I looked at for the month of May, we were like 10 inches above our average rainfall. And so we
We made
started.
it all the way through July without even really getting dry. It was
It
crazy.
it
It's
was
been raining here
crazy.
every day, man.
So we start getting these calls like, "Hey, we need wood. We got good prices." And so some of those sales that we had planned to put out, this fall, we went ahead and advertised those and sold those, back in kind of June, early July, whenever the prices were up. So we kind of look for things like that, little peaks in the
Yeah.
market where we can, take advantage of that. And it doesn't always work out that way. To get the best prices. Sometimes you have to sell stuff when you can sell it, but that's what we try to do. Especially if it's something that can be cut in wet weather. We try to kind of have those ready and put them out when the markets are right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's interesting too to kind of think about I'm just thinking about the role that the forester's playing, because I know people wonder about this. Like you said, people don't they come to you and don't even know what your role is, and they're asking you about that up front.
Yeah.
But you can start to stack things that are being accomplished. That not only are you providing some level of protection and expertise and making sure that the wood's paid for that's taken off, but also keeping an eye on the markets and letting some fine scale adjustment that could maximize revenue on the same wood that way. Like, you start stacking those things up, it can make a pretty big difference in terms of what people are doing on their land.
Yep.
And how much they're making in the process.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can look at it as, both with consulting foresters and wildlife biologists, yes, it is an expense to work with those people, but in the long term, your net revenue may benefit from having worked with those folks. From the timber side for all the reasons we've just discussed, and with the wildlife side, making sure that you're spending money where it's most effectively helping you accomplish your objectives. I mean, because all
Yeah, and
three of us
saving
run into
money.
landowners all the time that are spending lots of money on things that really aren't moving the needle. So it's
Yeah,
not just a cost. I mean, it can result in some significant savings too.
yeah. And then, if you have how much is that additional 20% of gobblers?
Put a number,
there's
put a value on
Yeah.
that.
Right. So
Yeah.
start thinking about it that way. Yeah, it may have cost you a little bit more, but if you got 20% more gobblers, it might be worth that, right?
I promise when there's 6 or 7 of them screaming at you in spring on an April morning, you're not going to be worried about that.
Yeah.
Nope.
That's fun. Michael, one of the things that I wanted to ask is, I was going to ask it, I think, with a little bit of a negative slant to it. Like, what are the things that landowners should not do when working with a forester? The things that are barriers, the barriers that they create to helping you be most effective in your job. But I'll flip that around and say, what are the things a landowner can do to help you be most effective at helping them? Right. So, are there specific things that you recommend to landowners that give them heartburn or are difficult to overcome, or that they're hesitant about?
I mean, we talked about it for just a second earlier, but the having the period like ripping the Band-Aid off, especially when it
Right.
comes to herbicide applications, it's hard sometimes because like right now is when we're doing a lot of understory spraying and
Mm-hmm.
people see, hey, I've got this good, understory, the habitat looks good, and we have intentions to do this, kind of a mid-rotation treatment. Well, they're afraid, like, hey, we're going to wipe that stuff out, and then all of
Right.
a sudden my deer aren't going to be here this winter, and my turkeys aren't going to be here this spring because it's just going to be barren. But that's one thing that I struggle with. I've had several conversations lately with landowners who are concerned about that if we spray now, we're going to have a bunch of dead stuff out there going into the fall and winter. But I just kind of ensure them that we've done this enough. If you do that in a pine stand this fall and then follow it up with a prescribed burn, you're gonna love what you see come springtime, and it's gonna
Yeah.
be a whole lot better going forward. So
Yeah.
that's one thing. We struggle and on the timber harvest side with debris piles and expectations of like the best area to set up a loader is in the middle of a food plot, on
Mm-hmm.
top of a knob. There's nowhere else to turn an 18-wheeler around. And, so we have to work through things like that sometimes. And that's one thing as a consultant is that I'm also trying to give the landowner realistic expectations and kind of work with him and say, this is, I know it's not what you want to see, having a loading deck sitting right here in your food plot, but that's the reality of it. We're going to have to, spend a little bit of money burning those piles and pushing up debris and getting that back in shape, just because in some places there's nowhere else to turn a truck around. It's going to
Mm-hmm.
compact your field. And so there's things like that sometimes I feel like I'm kind of I'm working for the landowner for their best interest, but I also kind of have to tell them this is part of the deal to get to where you want to
Yeah.
be. We got to work through, these things. So
Yeah. This is the
yeah,
reality of logging.
yeah, it's not a clean process, and even if you're in a market to where you can haul pine tops off of chip and saw and saw timber and get those cleaned up, you still end up with a lot of debris.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of log piles, and if you got a lot of cankers and stuff at the base of the trees that get cut off, you get these big piles of butts, that are hard to burn up, and that kind of stuff. It's hard for landowners to see that, until it is sitting there on their property, and they're like, well, what do I do now? So
Right.
one good thing that if I have another job close by, to be able to take somebody and show them an active site and
Right.
kind of say, this is what you can expect your place to look like, that's really helpful. If
Right.
nobody's ever cut timber before, they just don't know what they're going to be left with,
Right.
from a mess standpoint.
Yeah. Do you prefer to have the logging debris spread throughout the stand, or do you like it piled?
So my preference is on a first thinning, you have basically you're cutting the stuff down to a 2 or 3 inch top a lot of times. So
Mm-hmm.
on the pulpwood, so on a first thinning, I prefer that they spread that back through the rows. You can
Mm-hmm.
pretty much, if you spread it through the corridors and then you run over it, it'll just about disappear on a first thinning. Now, as you get to older timber where you have larger piles of debris, I like to pile those. Even if it means cutting out a bigger area around your loading area to pile those, I like to pile and try to burn those tops if possible. Because if you start distributing those big tops back out in the stand, it kind of gets to be a mess. And then if you want to follow that up with a prescribed burn, in the future, then you end up having these big brush piles that are out in the woods that are getting too hot. So, but it depends. Sometimes it depends on the size of the loading area and what the timber's like and that sort of thing. But I typically first thinning like to just distribute the debris back through the thinning, and on older stands try to pile it so we can burn it if the landowner wants it to disappear.
Or you can have me come burn it for you, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
that stand we did last
yeah,
year.
yeah. You definitely helped us out.
That wasn't part of the plan, but it got burned.
Yeah. Well, Michael, you guys addressed, thinking about landowner barriers, but I wanted to ask you directly because it seems like, at least in the recent past, this has become pretty common across some parts of the South. And you mentioned it earlier. What if we're in a bad market and we're having a real hard time selling timber? Like maybe you've got, a good product, but you don't have a market.
Hmm.
Are they just stuck, or what are some strategies that you might take to move wood? Because I think a lot of people find themselves in that kind of situation where they would like to cut timber because they know that they need to do it to meet some wildlife objectives, but they're just having a hard time getting it done.
It's a very good question right now.
Yeah. So I would say on thinnings, like if you have an unthinned stand of pine and you're in a tough market area, like right now, and one of our mills closed that, kind of in one of our areas that we work in, and so there's still the demand for pulpwood, but the prices have went down, and so landowners are going to have some time to, adjusting to very low pulpwood prices. We're talking maybe $1 or $2 a ton in the future for pine pulpwood, where it used to be $8 or $10 a ton. That's hard for a landowner to stomach if they're used to getting more money. But in those situations, I say you got to take what you can get and get your timber thin so that it can be growing. It doesn't get stagnant. Whether you're trying to manage for wildlife or you just want your timber to grow, on those unthinned plantations, you take what you can get for the stumpage when you can get it and get somebody in there to thin it. But that's kind of where we are in some market. Now, there's certain areas to where the pulpwood prices are still okay, and you can be a little more selective, or you may try to wait till you get a little better price. But in certain markets where it's hard to get thin, you take what you can get when you can get a crew there, and go ahead and get it thin and get the canopy open and let your trees grow. And we also will package things together too. If we have 4 or 5 landowners kind of in a small area where, say within a 5 or 10 mile radius of each other, we'll kind of package those together because they may have a mix. Somebody may have a first thinning, somebody may have a second thinning. They may have different things, and we can package those together maybe to sell to one buyer, one dealer, and maybe the same logger cuts them all, or maybe they have a couple loggers, that cut them. But we've been doing more of that too in the last few years, just kind of putting little packages together of timber sales, and trying to work with somebody to get them done. And that's what it takes sometimes. If you have a large enough, property, you may be able to package we'll give you a little bit of clear cut over here. We'll give you some better wood over here in order to get this first thinning done. But if you're talking, if you only own 100 acres, we may, have your property and a couple others kind of in a package to try to get, multiple landowners done at the same time. Because it just depends. The problem with the logging and what it's hard for people to understand when they see these stumpage prices reports and stuff come out, or they hear their neighbor talking about, hey, I got this much per ton. Is it's so property specific? There's so many things that are involved in what somebody's willing to pay for something and when it can get done. The access. Is it right off the side of a paved road that can be accessed all year round? Does it have a mile or two of internal woods roads you have to go that are going to have to go down that are going to have to be maintained? It's getting to be more of a problem now to where people are on limited quota for certain products that it's beneficial sometimes to have a timber sale that has multiple products, on one stand. If you got a first thinning that's 90% pine pulpwood, sometimes people won't, they just say, I can't do it. I'm sorry, because they need to cut 50 loads of wood a week to survive. They may only have 30 loads a week of pine pulpwood quota at the mill. So on a Wednesday, they're done. We've hauled all of our quota. We don't have anything to do the next 2 days. And so it really depends on, what market you're in and kind of how wet it is outside. And there's just a lot of factors that go into it. And that's what having a forester that's knows your local markets is going to be really beneficial to kind of help you understand all those.
Yeah.
All those things.
Yeah, I feel like these days in the deep south especially, like if you can get pine pulpwood to pay its way off the stump and off your property, you're doing pretty good.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, like I said, there's still some areas that have a pretty good pulpwood market, but there's also some that, you basically are having to give it away to get it done. And in those cases, if you find somebody that can do it, you take what you can get and get it things. If you look at the last year, we had this really bad southern pine beetle outbreak across Mississippi and Alabama, and they had the Alabama Forestry Commission has a GIS map with all the locations that they detected from the air. You start zooming in and looking at those, a high percentage of those pine beetle infestations are in unthinned pine plantation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was scrolling, looking northwest Alabama, central Alabama. It's probably 80 or 90% of the outbreaks you see are in unthinned plantations that people have either not gotten thinned by choice, or they haven't, been able to get somebody to thin those. That's where.
Yeah, I hear that so much now, especially in that area.
Yeah.
And people asking me for what do I do here? So it's definitely an important problem to deal with.
One thing I did want to ask about, Michael, was at first thin and residual basal area. A lot of folks get nervous about going too low because we're talking about obviously like forest management for wildlife, and with that, a lot of times we're thinning to basal areas that are lower than what would typically be recommended for just timber production, right? So at that first thin, if a landowner wants to go to a lower basal area than is tradition for the forest industry, are there concerns there about the stand and the stand's health? And particularly I'm thinking about wind throw, and how do you handle that?
Yeah, so if I had a preference, what I would prefer to do is thin a little bit more traditionally on the first thinning,
Mm-hmm.
and then let those trees recover and let the crowns fill out a little bit more and let them get a little more stability in the root system and everything, and then hit them a little heavier at a second thinning. That would be my preference.
Right.
And it kind of depends too. If you have a stand that has pretty high live crown ratio, when you go in there to first thin, I feel a little bit better about thinning it a little heavier. Sometimes these stands that are overdue for thinning, you see they have just a little tiny top, and they're
Q-tip
real
top.
Yeah, a little small green top, and they're real small. The average diameter is 6 or 7 inches in the stand. If you go in there and thin something like that, that's, let's say it's 50 or 60 feet tall with a really small crown, and you go in there and hit that really heavy on the first thinning, you're going to have a lot of wind throw.
Mm-hmm.
And some people are okay with that. Some people are like, hey, that's fine. If I end up with a 50 basal area and some of them fall over, then that's not a big deal to me. But
Right.
you know, you just have to know that going into it, that if
Yeah.
you thin that too heavy on the first thinning, you know, ideally my preference would be you know, maybe a 70 to 80 basal area in that range on the first thinning, and then 5 years, 4, 5, 6 years later, come back a second thinning and then take it down to whatever
Yeah.
that, you know, if it's a 50, 60 or
Right.
lower. But
If you think you're in a place where you have that
yeah.
that is an option to you, but like if you're
Right.
having a really hard time moving the trees,
hmm
then that may be a situation where you think about going lower at the first cut
Yeah.
in case we can't get them back,
hmm
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and just accept, you know, that there's some risk associated with it.
hmm Yeah.
Well, Michael, we're getting close to an hour, and we want to be respectful of your time because I know you got a lot to do.
I'm good.
What have we
I'm
failed
here
to?
for it.
What have we failed to ask you? Because we, you know, you got a lot of experience working with folks. What do people need to know that we haven't asked you?
Mm. I don't know. I think there's a whole lot of aspects in forest management that we deal with, and I do think it's important to have somebody kind of working on your behalf, because you talking about, we've talked mostly about timber harvesting. You know, we haven't really gotten into herbicide prescriptions. You know, if you're doing kind of a mid-story, understory treatment, or if you're doing site prep treatments with herbicide prescriptions.
I feel like we need to have you back for a whole nother episode with
Well,
that.
you know, and then you talk about seedling genetics, you know, whether you're going to species, you're going to plant longleaf, loblolly, or shortleaf. And then if it's loblolly, do you want third gen open pollinated or mass control pollinated seedlings? And what spacing are you going to plant those on? That, say, if you want some timber production, but you still have wildlife as a secondary objective, you probably don't want to plant 700 trees per acre. I don't recommend that for timber production now either. I mean, we're going a lot lower density, but you know, those are things to think about. So I feel like invasive species control, I mean, I don't know, when we're out there on the property, we see all these things. You know, we're out there looking at a timber harvest, or we see kudzu or cogan grass or whatever invasive species. I was on a place the other day that gave me a lot of anxiety because I counted so many different invasives. You know, it was like everything you can think about. When we had a Chinese tallow tree, kudzu, Japanese climbing fern, giant reed, Chinese privet. I mean, all within, I mean, eyesight, you know, and that's the kind of stuff that kind of gives me anxiety when I'm out there thinking about how are we going to deal with all this stuff. But I mean, I think just having a forester looking out for your property on your behalf, and seeing those kind of things and helping you make decisions, because there's a lot that goes into, you know, financially, you know, it can have a big impact on the decisions you make, and going forward, what are you going to leave, you know, for your family. You know, if you're thinking about, say, somebody that's getting older, and you know, I hear a lot of times, well, you know, I'm not going to see these trees if I plant these things back now or whatever. But I mean, I think that's important to kind of look forward. You know, what we do, we're looking at a 25-year, you know, plus rotation. And so you're planting and managing timber now for the next, you know, 25 plus years. So I think it's important to have somebody that's kind of looking out for you and helping you make those decisions, and, you know, working through. But there's a lot involved with forest management as a whole. You know, there's a lot that I think we do, and I don't think that landowners, you know, we get, like I mentioned earlier, about people asking what do we do for timber sales, but you know, there's a lot of people out there that, you know, do site prep and planning work, but you know, understanding those prescriptions and understanding what the prices are and the different application methods and everything, it's just good to have somebody that's kind of on your side, you know, helping you walk through all that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
What are some things, Michael, that people can? Is there a way that they could help determine who would be a good forester? Like, how can they vet these people, or maybe some of the questions they might ask?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you know, I would recommend, like, the Association of Consulting Foresters has a find a forester, you know, page there where you can go and you can search for kind of your county, state, and it'll have a list of people. The Forestry Commission also has a page there that
Mm-hmm.
has a tab that you can go to, like Alabama Forestry Commission, and you can select consulting forester or whatever you're looking for specifically. I was asked the same question on a panel one time with a forest landowners meeting, and my answer to the question at that time was, find somebody that your friend uses that like a personal reference. I find that goes a long way with establishing that relationship. If somebody calls me and they said, "Hey, I was referred to you by this person," and they're real happy, then there's that trust, all of a sudden, without me having to try to prove myself or, my understanding of forestry, like there's a connection there already. And so that already, if you can ask a friend and who they're using, find somebody, that locally, and ask them who their forester is and if they're happy with them. I mean, that's seems to me like the best situation possible. And if you don't have a connection like that and don't know who to ask, then you can go to those resources and make a few phone calls, and tell a forester what your objectives are, and see if it seems like it's a good fit. I mean, it definitely doesn't hurt to ask some questions and find out, if they're familiar with the markets, in your area. Tell them, hey, I'm interested in turkey or deer management or just timber production, and make sure that's something that they're interested in. There are foresters out there that, they're more geared for timber production. They're not as interested in helping with wildlife management. And, that's something I think from hunting and enjoying, being out. I love to turkey hunt and be in the woods, and that's all I've studied. When I made the decision to go into forestry, I've studied the wildlife management aspect, even though I don't have a degree, and I feel like that's kind of where I always lean towards, and that's just the landowners that I've kind of attracted over the past few years, just because that's what I like to do. But just find somebody that feels like a good fit, and maybe get a recommendation.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think this is a good opportunity too to just throw out a PSA. We've got a lot of younger listeners that are thinking about career paths and stuff like that, and they're always, you remember this, Michael, like back when you were in school, there seems to be this divide between foresters and wildlife biologists, because at almost every institution they're in the same program, right next to each other every day. But the further I get from school, it's actually the more I work with foresters, not the less.
Yeah, I agree.
So I mean, it's very important to establish relationships across that aisle, so to speak.
Yeah. Most of the landowners, I was just thinking about that. Most of the landowners that I have worked with in the past, they have me there for wildlife. I do have a forestry degree also, but they have a forester on, that they work with already also. And it's very common that I am working with that forester on what the actual final recommendations are for management on the property.
Yep.
So, I mean, that's super common, and I definitely think, I obviously have a biased opinion, but I think that's important for landowners because they're getting good information from people that specialize in that, and we're looking out for the landowner. I think we can pretty safely say the vast majority of professionals are doing that. They're trying to look out for people, but you always hear horror stories. It was actually, I was in North Carolina like a week ago, I guess, since we're recording this, and there was a forester that was speaking to the audience, and that was the same line of questioning that came up, was what we just talked about, like, how do I know who? And they had this particular landowner had a bad experience, and she was like, what do I need to do? How can I vet people beforehand? Because once it's done, it's done. So I think that, that's definitely something that's important. I'm glad we covered it.
Yeah, for a lot of smaller landowners, if they're clear cutting timber, that it may be like a once in a lifetime thing, or a couple times in a lifetime. So it's a pretty big decision. I think that a lot of people don't take lightly, and they want to make sure they're getting as much as they can for it, and make sure somebody's looking after them.
Sure. It certainly can transform your property for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
So, and potentially for multiple
For sure.
ancestors' lives.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Well, good. I felt like that was a pretty
great.
strong
Yeah.
episode. And
I think a lot of our listeners will appreciate that.
Yeah, definitely really direct. And hopefully for everybody out there listening, we're trying to address topics that you bring to us. This is another one that comes up really commonly. Will and I have some ideas for doing some other topic areas that have come from listener feedback and just our own thoughts about it. But, we are trying to go down this vein to talk about some practical things, like how do I get this done? Because it seems like that's coming up a lot. People are getting in that headspace that they have a pretty good idea. Okay, I've got these things to accomplish, but now they're wondering, how do we start?
The logistics of it, yeah. The implementation.
Right, the practical part. So thanks, Michael, for coming on. That was really great. And thanks everybody out there for listening. We really appreciate it. We appreciate all the feedback. Will, you brought up the other day, well, maybe yesterday, we haven't told anybody in a while, but if you haven't had a chance, please go and leave us a rating. It helps the algorithm.
It's good that you asked for that coming off of this episode and not one with just me and you talking about BS for 30 minutes before we get into anything with substance.
Well, I've gotten a few comments saying people like that, but I've also gotten some that people are like, y'all need to get to the point.
They're both right.
So, yep, they are. But yeah, we really appreciate it. I think that was great. And thanks everybody out there for listening.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.